Well, I hope you got the subtext. I'm actually the Aflac professor of New Testament. So I've got a new commercial. We're talking to the Amoses about doing a commercial for Asbury. So here's Bill Arnold, who's the Paul R. Amos professor of Old Testament, and here's me, Gene R. Amos, and we're talking to each other about how fortunate we are to have the Amoses endow our chairs. And the duck walks across in front of us and says, Asbury, Asbury. I like it. Their senior vice president said he's working on it. I have two wonderful things to share with you this morning about archaeology. Now, I'm not an archaeologist, nor the son of the archaeologist, nor do I play one on TV. I did sleep at a Holiday Inn last night. So, no, my job is to interpret the significance of artifacts in archaeology and related matters from antiquity as it is germane to and helps us interpret the New Testament. And unbeknownst to me, when I went off on sabbatical to Durham, not to be confused with North Carolina, the University of Durham in England, my alma mater, I went to do research and writing, no surprise, but what I discovered was really quite remarkable, and so I'm going to share with you something I actually discovered under the heading of text archaeology. Now, most of you will know who this is, I would guess. This is the most famous New Testament scholar of the 19th century, hands down from anywhere, America, the United Kingdom, Europe, the rest of the world. J.B. Lightfoot, Joseph Barber Lightfoot, was numero uno in so many different fields related to the New Testament. This is a picture of him reading his Greek New Testament. He did not live a long life. He died suddenly while he was Bishop of Durham in 1889, but he left a long legacy. Here's the famous painting of him that is in the Durham Cathedral Library. When he was made bishop in 1879, he moved from Cambridge, where he had been Wesleyan professor and Lady Margaret professor for years, to Durham, bringing with him everything. Now, he was a typical Brit. He didn't get married. He didn't drive. He was a professor's professor, to say the least. This is his book plate, which it really says a lot about him. His motto is right on the book plate. It says, only Dunelm, which is the ancient medieval name for Durham, only Dunelm, and to serve and protect the church. This is the book plate. Now, backstory. I went to Durham in 1977 to do my doctoral work. You know, this is BC, before cell phone, before computer. My poor wife had to type my doctoral dissertation on an IBM Selectric 3 twice, and it was long with little font balls for the Greek and the Hebrew and all this, that, and the other, to say the least. There was an exhibit in the Durham Cathedral Monks Dormitory Library of various ancient manuscripts. And in one of the glass cases, there was a notebook open, and I found 2 pages of a commentary on Acts 15 by J.B. Lightfoot in his own Victorian handwriting. I went and told my mentor, C.K. Barrett, about this, and he said, oh, we must look into this. Nothing happened. I was back in the 80s after I got my doctoral degree, and Jimmy Dunn was now the Lightfoot professor of New Testament at the University of Durham. I said, we need to look in, if there's 2 pages, there's got to be more. He said, oh, we must look into this. Nothing happened. Somewhere in the 80s, a man from Australia named G.R. Treloar came and did a doctoral thesis on Lightfoot as a historian, and he must have looked through some of the stuff I was eventually going to come across. but nothing but a monograph on Lightfoot as a historian came out of it. So last spring, 35 years after I first went there, I was named scholar in residence at Johns College in Durham, and I was determined to get to the bottom of this mystery. So I went and saw Dr. Catherine Turner, the head librarian of the Dean and Chapter Library at the Cathedral, not at the university now, at the Cathedral. The Cathedral has one of the most ancient and interesting libraries dating back to books from the Middle Ages by Bede and other things as well. And I said, show me the Lightfoot. Where is it? I want to see all of it. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's spoons, teacups, inkwells, garments, whatever it is, show it to me. So it was a Narnia-like experience. She took me to a bookcase on the bottom of which there was a cupboard. Think Narnia now. And when we opened the cover, there were boxes full of Lightfoot's notebooks. And I found 1,500 pages of unpublished Lightfoot commentaries on the Gospel of John, on Acts, on 2 Corinthians, on 1 Peter. And needless to say, I had to pick my jaw up off the ground because his commentaries on Paul's letters and on the Apostolic Fathers in the 19th century are still being published and reprinted today. So I kind of went, OMG, we've got to do something about this. So here's the cabinet. There's the bookshelf. Underneath, you see those boxes? Well, I didn't plan to spend my sabbatical weeding through boxes, but that's what I did and came up with this. Between June and late October, I spent every waking moment and every spare moment transcribing his Victorian scrawl into legible, computerized files. And it took a good long time to do this. I had to learn how to read Lightfoot Ease. And it's fascinating material. It's absolutely fascinating. Now, what you need to know about Lightfoot is not merely was he the greatest New Testament scholar of his age, he was probably the greatest classics scholar of his age. He knew all of ancient Greek literature. He knew all of the ancient Latin classics as well. He had about 17 languages. And as I was going through these manuscripts, just what a mind he had began to dawn on me, because he would frequently quote from memory people like, Homer, Herodotus, Socrates, Aristotle, Julius Caesar. In the Greek or in the Latin, he would just quote it from memory. And then in the margin, there'd be these little penciled check marks where underneath it said, checked this. That is, he rattled it off the top of his head and then went back and checked it. And I went, okay, I am not worthy. So, for example, this is a page from his Gospel of John commentary on the chronology of our Lord's life. And as you can see, there are actually several iterations of this. He originally wrote this as notes for his lectures at Cambridge, but he had plans to do these commentaries. Now, those plans went awry. And the reason they went awry was really twofold. Number one is because he and B.F. Westcott, also a bishop of Durham and a famous New Testament scholar at Cambridge, and a man named Hort, who was a New Testament scholar as well, got together and decided they would put together a Cambridge Bible commentary on the New Testament. And so they parsed out the New Testament between the three of them. Westcott was going to do the Gospels. Quite naturally, since he had already published a Galatians commentary, Lightfoot was going to do Paul, or as he called him, Sit Paul. And Hort was going to do pretty much everything else, like Acts. Well, basically, almost none of this got done. Westcott did publish a commentary on the Gospel of John, and this is why, even though Lightfoot had written most of a commentary on the Gospel of John, he never published it, because Westcott was his best friend, and he thought it would be bad form if he published a rival commentary on John, while Westcott's was doing quite well. Now, here's where it becomes really personal for me, because I had no idea that they had planned a Cambridge Bible commentary. Some years later, a man by the name of C.F.D. Moule, a also Cambridge professor of New Testament in my lifetime, he was there in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, into the 70s, who was the relative of Hanley Moule, who was the bishop right after Lightfoot in Durham, follow the bouncing ball, decided that since the aborted Cambridge Bible commentary was a project worth doing, he decided to revive it in the 60s. And 2 volumes, exactly 2, came out. Cranfield's St. Mark commentary and Moule's on Colossians and Philemon. And that was it. It never got any further. Now that I knew about. What I didn't know about was the Moule connection with one of Lightfoot's friends, Hanley Moule. And what I especially didn't know is that Lightfoot and Westcott and Hort had planned all along to do a Cambridge Bible commentary. Fast forward to 1986, where I proposed, look, there were these 2 volumes of a Cambridge Bible commentary by Charlie Moule and Charles Cranfield. How about if we, wow, that wouldn't have been good. How about if we actually do a new Cambridge Bible commentary series? Bill Arnold and I signed on to be editors of this series, and I'm here to tell you this morning, it's doing just fine. In fact, it has now about 15 volumes in the series already, and we are assigning more. And so finally, Lightfoot's vision of a Cambridge Bible commentary is coming to pass not only for the New Testament, but for the Old Testament as well. I had no idea that I was the inheritor of the brainchild of Lightfoot until I found these manuscripts. Now again, just look at this. You'll see that there are 2 iterations of this. One is in a darker hand, one is in a lighter hand. The lighter hand, not surprisingly, is the older part of the manuscript. And so you have to make decisions when you're doing text archaeology. Do you just include everything that's there? Do you include the things that he crossed out on the second go-through? Sometimes I did and sometimes I didn't, depending on whether I thought it was helpful or not. Now, this really is quite interesting. Over here in the margin, from memory, he is citing passages from Bellum Judaicum, that is Josephus' Jewish Wars, with the Greek here, and again here, and again here. And he's got little check marks saying where he's checked this as well. He's talking at this particular point about who were the Roman governors in Judea. So I had to deal with multiple manuscripts. There are, in fact, 2 whole manuscripts of Acts. One goes up through Acts 20, the other goes up through Acts 21. I had to conflate this material to present Lightfoot's greatest hits on Acts, since we're only doing 1 volume. Or again, sometimes he remembers something that he wants to include, which he includes below where it really ought to be. So you have to figure out where in the manuscript does this go, because usually what happens is he circles a paragraph and points an arrow up, and not exactly where up it should go. So, Lightfoot was an expert in the Greek of the whole period from the 4th century BC to the 4th century AD. He knew at least 16 or 17 languages, including the following: Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, French, German, Italian, Latin, Arabic, to name but a few. And he uses all of these languages in these manuscripts. There is a famous story about him when he was growing up in Liverpool. He was in a private school for bright young Brits, And his mother wrote his tutor and asked, "How is my son Joseph doing in German?" And the professor wrote back to her, "Oh, he's already finished German. He's moved on to Coptic." I went, "Yes, we are not worthy." Okay. Now, besides being the leading philologist, expert in languages of his time, he was also the leading historian. Reading his unpublished manuscripts is like reading Biblical Archaeology Review. He reads the archaeology reports, he does the text criticism on the Greek New Testament, he knows the historical context, he knows the linguistic context, he knows the social context, he knows all of the relevant scholarship. At one point he even says, before anyone proposes to write a book, they must read everything that's ever been written on the subject first. Okay, in the middle of the 19th century, this might have been remotely possible on some subjects. It is so not possible anymore. There's not enough world and time to do that. So he knew all the relevant biblical scholarship on the bits that he was writing on. There's the quote, "Before you write a book on something, you must first read everything in any language on the subject." Now, Lightfoot had equal expertise in the Gospel of John, the epistles of the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostle, and the Apostolic Fathers. He knew them all. You may know the name Adolf von Harnack. He was a famous German church historian from the late 19th and into the early 20th century. And Harnack, who was no conservative, unlike Lightfoot, says, Lightfoot has produced the finest critical editions on Ignatius, Clement, Polycarp, Irenaeus that have ever been done. And friends, they are still in print. They are still in print. And his commentaries on Galatians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians were famous. They're still famous. I had to read them when I was in seminary. And they went through many editions, and they're still being reprinted today. Now here I have some good news. Hear the good news. InterVarsity's academic press has agreed to publish 3 fulsome volumes of what I have found called the Lightfoot Legacy, the first of which will come out next November at the National Society of Biblical Literature meeting on the Acts of the Apostles and related essays. And then we will have the Gospel of John, and then we will have 2 Corinthians and 1 Peter as well. One of the great contributions of these volumes is that we have a thorough-going deconstruction of the origins of modern liberal German New Testament scholarship. You may not know the name D.F. Strauss, but he is really the first person from Tübingen that got the ball rolling on what came to be called German higher criticism. He wrote a book called Leben Jesu, The Life of Jesus, in which he sort of did the Jesus seminar thing on the 4 Gospels. And this really got the ball rolling in Tübingen. But the real dude who got all of these kinds of ways of approaching the text critically from a German point of view was F.C. Bauer, not to be confused with our own David Bauer. No relation. Trust me, no relation. What F.C. Bauer is he's the forefather of form criticism and redaction criticism and source criticism, which Bultmann and Debelius made famous in the 20th century. Had we had what Lightfoot wrote in these 3 volumes in the middle of the 19th century and early 20th century, I think it would have changed the course of New Testament scholarship. I think we wouldn't have a lot of that stuff, which is still rattling around in the guild today. For one thing, Lightfoot provides slam-dunk arguments for the fact that the Gospel of John is in fact written by an eyewitness. It is not a later redaction of multiple layers of sources by 23 different scribes who could care less. It is an eyewitness testimony to the life of Jesus. So that's the first thing I want to talk to you about. That's text archaeology. But I have one more thing I want to talk to you about, which is equally interesting. So we're going to Turkey. And we're going to a particular place in Turkey that I've spent a fair bit of time. Here in southeastern Turkey is a town called Urfa. Actually, its whole name is Şanlıurfa, beautiful Urfa. And outside of Urfa in southeastern Turkey, above Lebanon, above Syria, is Gockley. That's where we're going for the rest of our time this morning. We're going to Gockley. It's 12 clicks outside of Urfa. And what has been discovered there, friends, hold your breath now, is the oldest religious structure in the world. It dates to 8 to 10,000 BC. 8 to 10,000 BC. This is before those cuneiform tablets were ever written. It's before writing. It's thousands of years before the pyramids. It's beaucoup thousands of years before, say, things like Stonehenge. These are stone circles on top of a mountain. It is an ancient high place. And it is revolutionizing the whole way that anthropologists and sociologists are now looking at the origins of human civilization. So I want to walk you through this discovery. Here's a drawing from National Geographic of what we're talking about. We're talking about stone circles on top of this hill, Gockley Tepe. By the way, Gockley Tepe in Turkish means pot-bellied hill. Big, round hill, okay? On top of this hill, the radiometry studies have shown that there are 20, not one like Stonehenge or 2 as in Avebury Stone Circle in England, 20 stone circles. 20. Hold that thought. Now, this is me on top of the hill the last time I was there. What you're looking at is from the top of the hill towards Syria. You can see about 30, 40, 50 miles on a clear day in any direction. This is a high place, a traditional ancient high place where religious rituals were performed. This is at the entranceway, and what you see here is some of the limestone that's on the top of this hill that was quarried to help build these stone circles. We'll say more about that, but this is just mainly to give you a sense of the view from the top of the ridge. And this is from the bottom of the hill, looking up the hill to where the stone circles are. Now, if you know your Old Testament, you know there's plenty of places where we have condemnations of high places because pagan religious rituals were performed there. This is what we're dealing with. We are dealing with stone circles with monolithic stones in them, and they are carved. They have animals and humans carved on them. In that regard, they are nothing like Stonehenge or Asbury Stone Circle, and we'll get to some of the pictures. For example, here we have one, and by the way, each of these stones weighs over 2 tons, so I want you to picture somebody in 8000 BC carving this, outlining an animal or a human hand on it, and then moving it into place in a stone circle. This is some kind of reptilian critter, and this is probably the hand either of a god or of a priest reaching down and picking up the animal. This was a place of sacrifice. What we know about ancient religion in the ancient Near East is it involves priests, temples, and sacrifices. Throughout the ancient Near East, the essence of religion was priests, temples or high places, and sacrifices. And I need to go back to my map real quick. I want to show you a picture. Go. Now, notice this. We have 2 rivers here, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Where do we hear about the Tigris and the Euphrates in the Bible? Survey says Garden of Eden. Friends, this is in the same vicinity of where the Bible says human civilization began at all. Let that soak in for a while. Okay, now some of these stone circles have had to be enclosed in walls, and they were, to protect them. When you're offering an animal in sacrifice, you need to be able to bring them in, tether them, slit their throat, and then offer them on the altar. And so some of these are enclosed areas, you would think, for maybe the bigger animals. But this is how it all got started. It all got started in 1993. A Turkish farmer was plowing along, chewing on his Turkish delight. Clank! He ran into this stone on the top of this hill. Now, this is the top stone of one of these columns. Everything else is under the dirt. So, from 1993 until now, they have succeeded in excavating exactly 3 of the 20 stone circles. It's going to take a while. Hopefully Jesus won't come back too soon before we get this done, because this is really fascinating stuff. Now, here you can begin to see the columns. And if you look at these columns, there are like what you'd call indentations or dimples on the top. So it appears that there were things on top of some of these columns, and it may have to do with the practice called excarnation as opposed to incarnation. Excarnation is when you lay an animal's carcass on some kind of stretcher-like thing on top of columns so that the birds can excarnate the animals, so that the vultures can come and eat the flesh off of the animals. And it's part of an offering to one deity or another. Now, some of these are a little hard to see, so I'm going to have to describe them to you. But here we have a water buffalo complete with horns carved right there. And below it we have the shadow of a warthog. More on him in a minute. I've got a better picture of him in a minute. This shows you the kind of work that has to be done. One of the problems with archaeology is that once you unearth something, then it's subject to wind and weather and erosion of various kinds. And obviously, documents erode more quickly once they are exposed to light after thousands of years. But even limestone is subject to such things. So this past season, this past summer, they spent almost the entire summer building shelters to cover the stone circles they have unearthed to protect them. Here they're just putting cloths over them while I was there. Now, here's an interesting feature. You see this hole? No, they didn't have a Black & Decker drill, so ask yourself, how did they do this hole? This is before the Bronze Age. This is before the Iron Age. How exactly did they make this hole? It looks like a pretty symmetrical hole. And what is it for? It is to tether a large animal. We know this because at Megiddo, that's exactly what the holes were for. They were next to watering troughs. It's where Solomon and others would tether their horses next to a watering trough, and they'd have a standing stone with a hole in it. Now, here's one of the most famous of these. This is taken from an article in Nat Geo. This is a priest. You see his ceremonial cummerbund and loincloth, 3 prongs to the loincloth. You see his fingers here? Very interesting. This is a person in religious attire. By the way, do me a favor. Don't tell the folks at the Kentucky Creation Science Center up in northern Kentucky that this site is from 8 to 10,000 BC. They don't think anything existed then. Okay, now here is another interesting bit. Here we have a human figure, you see? And one of the most interesting things about these carvings in this Turkish limestone is that the animal carvings are more detailed and precise than the human carvings. Well, this was before mirrors. But I like this one. In honor of the March Madness, this is a wildcat. Notice the ribs here. Notice the detail in the feet. Notice the teeth here. This is almost a three-dimensional carving on one of the sides of one of these columns. Now, here's really how we know it all happened just on this hill. This is one of the columns that was being carved on top of the hill, and then it all suddenly stopped. It stopped suddenly. This one not only didn't get erected, it didn't get moved. It's just sitting there lying in the ground, carved on the top of the hill. When Klaus Schmidt, who is the German archaeologist from Berlin, who is spending the rest of his life at Gockley, he's been there since the 90s, when he first got to this site, and the only thing that could be seen was that headstone of one of the monolithic stones, he discovered that, especially the lower ones, are under about 40 feet of sand. Hold that thought. So somebody has hypothesized, well, they dragged that sand up there and they buried this whole site because there were enemies coming that they were afraid were going to desecrate their religious site. I'm thinking they didn't have dump trucks in 8000 BC, and where would the sand actually have come from? It would have come from the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Cue the Noah movie. This site is within striking distance of Mount Ararat. Could it be that we have evidence here of a massive regional flood that buried this hill under 40 feet of sand while they were visibly worshiping pagan deities? I think that's a far more reasonable hypothesis than the hypothesis that they took their wheelbarrows and went down to the Tigris and Euphrates and day after day for about 10 years in a row tried to cover up the evidence of their religious site to protect it from invading marauders from Syria or somewhere. In the Urfa Museum, we have little objects that might have been stolen from the site. This is one of these little wildcats here that's in the Urfa Museum. There were some isolated articles of carving that are not on a column. And here's the front of that. I like to call this one, Grandma, what big teeth you have. I mean, look at that. Look at the detail and the time taken to carve this image of these animals. Also in this museum is a statue of a priest found nearby at Corvée. And what I want you to notice is he's also got the cummerbund, but he's got the V-neck priest sweater, which he got from Joseph A. Bank, no doubt. But again, notice how nondescript the human images are compared to the images of the animals themselves. And now we're really going to get down to it. Look at this one. This is a riot of carving. There's the drill hole. Here's the warthog. You know why you need this. You're going to have to tie that boy down if you're going to sacrifice him. That's a warthog complete with lots of teeth. Up here we have 3 camels. No wise men, but 3 camels nonetheless. We have 3 camels. It's in the Urfa Museum in southeastern Turkey, which is 12 kilometers away. This is some kind of leopard or cheetah. And this one is interesting because you see the spear through the animal, showing how it was killed. But again, emphasis on his whiskers and his teeth and his pointed ears and his big tail. Now, I want to read you just segments of this. Listen to this. Gobekli Tepe is the oldest human-made place of worship yet discovered. Until excavations began, a complex on this scale was not thought possible for a community so ancient. So I need to review for you the normal way secular anthropologists have looked at human history. It begins with cavemen. And then there are hunter-gatherers, okay? And then there is the invention of agriculture, and agriculture makes people sedentary. You're going to farm, you're going to have to live on the farm, right? Okay. And then after agriculture produces village life, after there is village life for a long period of time, then religion is brought in to help people just get along. Now, that model of the development and origins of human civilization has been turned upside down by this find. Because what this is telling us is as far back as we can trace any human origins, they were religious. Cue Genesis 1 and 2. And they were created in the image of God. Could it be that human beings were religious, meant for a relationship with God from day one? Survey says yes. And now secular anthropologists are having to rethink their whole view of religion in antiquity and when it began. Because this site is a religious-specific site, so far as we know. There is no sign of a village life. There is no sign of human life. It's out in the middle of nowhere on top of a hill. They spent hundreds and thousands of days building this religious site. What does this tell you about them? They were religious to the core. They were profoundly religious. Religion was not, as Karl Marx said, added on to civilization late in the game. We have a lot of people in North America that think that's what religion is. That religion is sort of a nice spiritual chicken soup for the soul add-on after everything else. What if it is true that we are all homo religios, inherently, profoundly religious? What if it is true that there are only two kinds of religion, good religion and bad religion? And what does it tell us about ancient human beings? That the essence of religion for them was priests, temples, and sacrifices. I'll tell you what it tells us. It is a testimony to human fallenness. Because the reason you're offering sacrifices to a or multiple deities is to placate the deity because you are estranged from it. You are alienated. You are afraid of your God. And you need to be appeasing him or reconciled to him so all will go well with your life. That is the essence of the reason for priests, temples, and sacrifices. Now, notice this right here. Stratum 2 is dated to pre-pottery. That is, before there was any pottery, way before there was any writing, way before there were any pyramids. Hello, Egypt, you don't have the most ancient civilization. Okay, no, civilization began in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Now, look at the list of what they have found so far carved on these stones. There are lions and bulls and boars and foxes and gazelles and asses and snakes and reptiles and insects and arachnids and birds, especially vultures and waterfowl and lions and tigers and bears. Oh my! All kinds of animals carved on these columns. All kinds of animals. I need to tell you with some dismay that we now know for a fact that that thing called an eagle in Isaiah was not an eagle. Maybe you know the song, "Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up like with wings of great length." I got news for you. There were no eagles. There were vultures. The word in Hebrew probably means the vulture. I don't want to mount up like a vulture with wings of great length. However, I have a picture of one. But first, look at this. Here is a water buffalo. Here is another reptile. And here we have an ibis or an ostrich here, a waterfowl, because this is near water. This is near these two rivers, to say the least. Now look at this one. This is really good. Now here we have huts, probably workers' huts. We have found no human remains at all. None. What we have found is piles of gazelle bones, the ancient equivalent of chicken wings. So the workers were eating buffalo wings while erecting these stones, okay? Here is the griffin vulture. You see this guy with the crooked beak? This is so not an eagle. This is the griffin vulture referred to in the Bible and other ancient Near Eastern literature. And here are waterfowl, ibis here. And here we have a scorpion. All kinds of critters being depicted. Now, there was a hysterical channel special where it was suggested, there have been two. One suggested that aliens built this. Okay. And the second one was that this was Noah's menagerie from which he selected animals to put in the ark. I kind of like the second one better than the first one. They're probably neither one true. No, this is a sacrificial site. Sorry, Russell Crowe. Some of these interesting stone circles are tiered. They have a sort of spiral to them so that the sacrifice of, I suppose, the chief animal would be on top of the circle and lesser animals would be sacrificed below that. As I said, a few objects were found here that have been put in a museum because otherwise somebody will put the five-finger discount on them. This is a fertility goddess. This was found on the site. This is actually a very typical image of an ancient fertility goddess. We've got others that look like this. So this will tell you perhaps one of the deities involved. Why do you offer sacrifices to a fertility goddess? For the crops and also for human fertility, and you're praying for rain. Okay. Now, I have shown you two very different kinds of archaeological finds. One was buried in the dust of a library. The other was buried in the ground on a hill outside of Urfa in southeastern Turkey. Both of these kinds of archaeology are extremely essential to our faith because our faith is historically grounded and historically founded. As I said last night, if Christ is not raised in space and time and history, our faith is in vain. Right at the core of the foundation of our faith is not just nice little theological ideas, it's history. And this is something Lightfoot insisted on, and it's something I would insist on as well. The Bible teaches us about three subjects: history, theology, and ethics. It is not a scientific textbook for a pre-scientific era. It's not a lot of things. It's not a modern guide to how to read what is happening in Syria and Russia today. That's not how ancient prophecy worked anyway. But what it is an affirmation of what our historical and theological and ethical foundations are. And so when we dig up something like this out of the ground, God is revealing to us yet one more window on the ancient world so that we would understand the context of all of these things better. One final story, which I think you'll appreciate. I was pastoring in the middle of North Carolina near Asheboro, and I had 4 little United Methodist churches. So I was fulfilling my destiny as a Methodist circuit rider, and by the 4th time, the sermon was pretty good, since I had to preach in all 4 churches. It was good practice. And while I was there, I got a phone call, and you know, there are questions people ask you in the parish that seminary doesn't prepare you for. I got a phone call from Glenn Ray Smith from Siler City, where Aunt Bee retired. He called me up and said, Dr. Ben, this is Glenn Ray. Now, Glenn Ray was a carpenter. He was a new Christian. He said, you know, Dr. Ben, I'm a new Christian, and I don't know my Bible very well. But my fellow carpenter, Larry, he's a King James only kind of guy, and we were talking while we were nailing down shingles on a roof. And I said, you know, I'm going to breed my hunting dogs. And he said, oh, no, you can't do that. The Bible says you shouldn't breed dogs. Seriously. He called me up, worried he might be violating the Bible. He said, I don't want to do anything to violate the Word of God. Does the Bible really say you can't breed dogs? I said, Glenn Ray, I'll look up every pea-picking reference to dog in the King James lexicon, and I'll get back to you. So I went through all the references in the New Testament to the word dog, nothing of any relevance. I started going through the Old Testament references, beginning with the Pentateuch, and I came across these words in the 1611 edition of the King James. Thou shalt not breed with the dogs. I called up Glenn Ray. I said, Glenn Ray, I got good news, I got bad news. Give me the good news first. He says, well, those furry little four-footed tailwhack, you can breed all those you want. Well, Dr. Ben, what could the bad news be? Well, there is this verse that in the King James says, thou shalt not breed with the dogs, but in context, what it means is true Israelites should not sexually fraternize with foreign women. He processed that for a minute. Then he said, I'm feeling ever so much better now, Dr. Ben. My wife, Betty Sue's just from Chatham County. A text without a context is just a pretext for whatever you want it to mean, and one of the most important contexts is the historical and archaeological context. Thank you very much. Now, I've got 10 minutes to answer questions, so what questions do you have? Yes, ma'am. Yes. I don't think they went down to the river and looked at their face in the water every morning. You know, they weren't narcissists in the same way we are. They didn't use cosmetics or lipstick. They were not stuck on their own outward personal appearance. They were far more interested in how the animals looked than how they looked. That ought to teach us a little lesson about ourselves. You know, we have commercials that say things like, image is everything. Ancient peoples didn't believe that. Yes, sir, there was a question over here. Oh, excellent. Very good. Yes, the attire of the priest was important to make clear that he's a priest. He's not just anybody. Yes, ma'am. Well, right. The question is, what about the image of God? Maybe they didn't feel comfortable conveying the image of God. Well, I doubt these people had the biblical theology of humans created in the image of God. That's a biblical idea. We don't find it in ancient Hittite literature or Assyrian literature. In fact, the only person called a son of God in much of the ancient Near Eastern literature is the king. He was deemed to have a special relationship with God, even some cases quasi-divine. But ordinary hoi polloi, the idea that they would be the representative of God on earth, not so much, no. We don't really have that in other ancient Near Eastern literature. Yes, sir. There really isn't, but we know from this general area about the polytheism that went on. You see, here's one of the things that happened. Once they became sedentary and practiced agriculture, but this is pre-agriculture. And here's the other interesting thing I forgot to tell you. 2 miles from there is the first place on earth they have found seed corn. So we also know, so far as we can tell so far, that the beginning of agriculture began in this very region as well. Okay? But here's the thing. You don't need to placate fertility gods or goddesses unless you're beginning to raise crops and you need rain. Right? You don't start singing, "We need some rain." You know, you don't start singing that if you're hunter-gatherers living in a cave. Right? Okay, that's when agriculture comes that the Baals of this world become important for the fertility of the crops as well as human fertility as well. So this is pre-Baal as well. Other questions? Yes, Chuck? Okay. I knew somebody was going to ask me. I'm really glad. Okay. There are 5 ways that we can come to this conclusion, but I'll need to focus on 3. First of... No, that's layer 2. Stratum 2 is 750 to 6,000. Stratum 1, the bottom layer, that's 8 to 10,000. Okay, yeah. Stratum 2, yeah, I just put up the pre-pottery stratum to let you know how old it really was. First of all, there's radiocarbon dating, okay? And that can be done not only on wooden objects or manuscripts, because, I mean, this is before writing. Obviously, we're not going to find any manuscripts here. This is before cuneiform. This is before human writing, right? But what we do have, what we definitely do have, is there are bits of wood that we can test. And more importantly, we can actually test the bones that have been charred. You see, when you immolate an animal, and some of these animals that were sacrificed were burned, as in whole burnt offerings, the kinds you get at Hardee's, you know, that kind of thing, okay? When they immolated an animal, it charred the bones. We can test the char on the bones. And that gives us a range of about 200 years plus or minus. And that's why we're really sure that this is older than 7500 BC. So there's that. And then, of course, the third thing that people look for is pottery. But here we have no pottery, right? But what we do have is we have a menagerie of animals depicted, some of which did not exist in this region as late as the biblical period, say Abraham, okay? So all of a sudden we're dealing with, now remember where Abraham came from. He came from where? Ur. He was not an early Jew. He came from Ur of the Chaldees. And where did he go? He went to Haran, which, by the way, is 15 miles from this site. Are you with me now? This is the cradle of civilization. Right there in southeastern Turkey, you can see the whole thing. It's also the cradle of Christianity, because at the bottom of that little picture is Antioch, where people were first called Christianoi, Christians. Yes. Well, Tarsus is on the coast, on the south coast, which would be southwest of that by a bit. Okay, so those are the 3 main ways that they have been doing the testing. But what has really shocked them about this is the degree of detail of these critters. And thus far, they've found no tools. Now, maybe they will find a tool. And maybe we'll discover the Iron Age wasn't the Iron Age and the Bronze Age wasn't the Bronze Age, because they actually had tools like that much earlier. Maybe we will. But right now, no tools have been discovered, so we don't know how the heck they did this. They didn't do it with their fingernails. I'm confident of that. Other questions? Yes, sir. Well, that's a good question. Are they still living in caves? Well, what I can tell you about southeastern Turkey is that unless you're on top of Mount Ararat, the climate is temperate. So they could well have lived out in the open. They could have well made tents out of animal hides, and we assume they did. You saw the one picture of what looked like temporary shelters. Here's an interesting thing. If you go to Haran today, you will come across some of the most interesting dwellings you have ever seen in your life. They are made out of dung wheels. I think you know what dung is. And dung wheels were burned. It's animal orger, right? But these houses, these shelters, are built up out of twigs and sticks, and the dung is used as glue, and they look like beehives. They look like little beehives. They're in the same shape as those things. You can actually see these. There's still people living in these structures in Haran today. You can go see them, and they're really quite remarkable. My friend Mark Fairchild from Huntingdon University and I bomb all over Turkey to these archaeological sites. And one day we were invited into one of these houses in Haran, and they wanted to serve us ayran. Now, what is ayran? Nothing to do with the country. It is a kind of goat's milk yogurt that is tray sour. And they don't have refrigerators, so it's not chilled. It's not like Yoplait or anything. And, you know, these people are in an honor and shame culture, so you have to drink it because it's them offering you hospitality. Let me tell you, it didn't make me want to go back to Haran again. In fact, Haran from there, right after that. You can, if you go to this region, you can begin to see the telltale signs of the beginning of human civilization. And some of it is still just as primitive as it ever was, even in this era, many thousands of years BC. So let me just frame this for you one more time. We're talking about a time that is at least 9,500 years before now, and perhaps 11 or 12,000 years before now. That makes it close to 8,000 years before Abraham. That's a lot, to say the least. Thank you very much.